The screams came from the wall during the champagne toast. No one else heard them. The orchestra played too loud. The guests laughed too loud, but I heard them. After 40 years serving the wealthiest people in the world, you learn to hear what shouldn't be there. And on that December night in 1987, at the Ashford Mansion, I heard something no butler should ever hear. Everyone was toasting the new Mrs. Hastings. She was radiant. He was in love. The guests applauded. And then, from the wall behind me, golden silk paper, imported from Italy, flawless. A sound, faint, muffled, almost nothing. Help, please. I looked around. No one had noticed. No one but me. I had a choice in that moment. The same choice we all face when we hear something we shouldn't, when we see something we cannot unsee, pretend it didn't happen, or investigate. I chose to investigate. And that choice, that single choice in 40 years of perfect silence. Well, let me tell you what happened when a butler finally decided not to be invisible. My name is not important. In my profession, names are meant to fade into the background like the wallpaper we stand against. But if you must call me something, you may call me James. I've been called that before, though it wasn't always my name. It's what people expect a butler to be called, so I answer to it without complaint. I came to service in 1947, fresh from the war, though I was barely old enough to have fought in it. I lied about my age to enlist, you see, 15 years old and desperate to matter. The war taught me many things, but the most valuable lesson was this: how to stand perfectly still while chaos erupted around me, how to keep my face blank when I witnessed horror, how to survive by becoming invisible. These skills, as it turned out, were perfect preparation for a life in service to the very wealthy. By 1987, I had worked in 17 different households. I had served oil barons in Texas, tech pioneers in California, and old money families in New England, whose wealth dated back to before the Revolutionary War. I had seen things that would make your skin crawl, and things that would break your heart. And through it all, I had maintained the single most important rule of my profession: silence. A good butler sees everything and says nothing. He's a ghost who pours wine, a shadow who opens doors, a piece of furniture that happens to be made of flesh and blood. The wealthy don't want servants who have opinions or emotions, or, God forbid, moral judgments. They want efficiency, they want discretion, they want to be able to do absolutely anything they please without worrying that the help is watching. And for 40 years I gave them exactly that. Until that December night at the Ashford Mansion. I had been with the Hastings family for 3 years by then, not the longest employment of my career, but long enough to understand the household dynamics, the unspoken rules, the careful choreography of wealth and power that played out daily in those marble halls. Richard Hastings was what people called new money, though his fortune was old enough by then to have developed a respectable patina. He'd made his billions in commercial real estate in the early 1970s, buying up failing shopping centers and transforming them into glittering retail palaces. He was 53 years old in 1987, with silver hair that he wore swept back from a face that had once been handsome but was now merely distinguished. He had the look of a man who had won at life and knew it. His first wife, Catherine, had died of cancer in 1983. It was a long, ugly death that I witnessed from the edges of rooms, bringing morphine on silver trays, holding doors open for doctors who could do nothing. Mr. Hastings had loved her, in his way. He wept at her funeral, real tears that stained the lapels of his $10,000 suit. But men like Richard Hastings don't stay alone for long. He met Victoria Crane in the spring of 1986 at a charity gala in Manhattan. She was 32 years old, which made her young enough to be exciting, but old enough to be taken seriously by his circle. She had worked as an executive assistant for a publishing house, though she'd quit her job within a month of meeting Richard. Why work, after all, when you could be courted by a billionaire? I watched their courtship from my usual position, 3 steps back and to the left, invisible. I watched Richard transform from a grieving widower into a man drunk on second chances. I watched Victoria slowly, carefully, methodically wrap herself around his life, like ivy claiming a tree. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. Tall and slim, with blonde hair that she wore in a sleek bob that probably cost more to maintain than most people's monthly mortgage. She had pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink, and a smile that showed too many teeth. She reminded me of the porcelain dolls my sister used to collect as a child, pretty and perfect and somehow deeply wrong. But Richard couldn't see it, or wouldn't. When a lonely man meets a beautiful woman who makes him feel young again, he doesn't ask too many questions. He doesn't wonder why she never talks about her family, or why she has no close friends, or why the staff all go quiet when she enters a room. He just falls in love and plans a wedding. The Ashford mansion wasn't Richard's primary residence. That was a penthouse in Manhattan that overlooked Central Park. But the Ashford estate, about 90 miles north of the city, was where he went to feel like an aristocrat. 27 rooms, 12 acres of grounds, a ballroom that could hold 200 guests, and a wine cellar that contained bottles older than the United States itself. It was the perfect venue for a December wedding that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. I had been at the estate for 2 weeks before the wedding, overseeing the preparations. There were florists from Amsterdam, caterers from Paris, a wedding planner from London who barked orders in an accent so posh it could cut glass. There were ice sculptors and lighting designers, and a small army of temporary staff hired just for the event. And through it all, I watched Victoria. She was different at the estate than she was in the city. In Manhattan, she played the role of devoted fiancée with perfect precision. But here, away from Richard's constant attention, I caught glimpses of something else. The way she snapped at the flower girl during rehearsal, a vicious little hiss that made the child burst into tears. The way she complained about the vintage of champagne, even though it was a 1982 Dom Perignon that cost more per bottle than I made in a week. The way she looked at the mansion itself, her eyes calculating and cold, like she was already measuring which pieces of furniture she would sell once she had control of the estate. But I said nothing. It wasn't my place to warn Mr. Hastings that his bride might be less than she appeared. Men don't listen to their butlers about matters of the heart, and attempting to offer advice would have only gotten me dismissed. So I kept my observations to myself and continued preparing for a wedding I knew, deep in my bones, was a terrible mistake. The day of the wedding was December 19th, 1987, a Saturday. The weather cooperated beautifully, as if even nature had been paid off to ensure perfection. Cold but clear, with just enough snow on the ground to look picturesque without making travel difficult. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon, with the reception to follow immediately after in the ballroom. I spent the morning managing last-minute crises, everything from a delivery van that got stuck in the driveway to a bridesmaid who discovered her dress had been hemmed an inch too short. By 2 o'clock, when the guests began to arrive, I was already exhausted. But butlers don't get to be exhausted. We get to be invisible. The ceremony itself was held in the estate's conservatory, a glass room filled with tropical plants that Richard's first wife had loved. I thought it was in poor taste to marry his second wife in Catherine's favorite room, but no one had asked my opinion. Victoria walked down an aisle of white roses, her dress a confection of French lace that had cost, according to the hushed whispers of the other staff, $75,000. She looked like a princess. She looked like a dream. She looked like exactly what she was, a beautiful lie. Richard wept during the vows. Victoria's eyes remained perfectly dry. And then it was done. They were married. The guests applauded. Champagne corks popped. The photographer snapped picture after picture of the happy couple, none of which would capture the truth I could see in Victoria's eyes when she thought no one was watching. The reception was a blur of efficient chaos. 200 guests, most of whom I'd served before in one capacity or another, tech billionaires and society matrons, politicians and athletes and actors whose faces I recognized from movie posters. They filled the ballroom with noise and laughter and the particular brand of careless joy that comes from having more money than problems. The orchestra played Vivaldi. The caterers served foie gras and lobster and tiny, perfect desserts that looked like jewelry. I moved through the crowd like water, refilling glasses, removing plates, maintaining the illusion that everything was running smoothly without anyone having to actually work at it. I had positioned myself near the east wall of the ballroom, which gave me a clear view of the head table where Richard and Victoria sat like royalty, surveying their kingdom. The wall behind me was covered in that golden silk paper I mentioned, custom-made in Italy, at a cost that could have fed a family for a year. It was beautiful and ridiculous in equal measure, which made it perfect for the Ashford mansion. The speeches had just finished. Richard's oldest friend, a man named Harold, who'd made his fortune in oil futures, had told a rambling story about their college days that made everyone laugh and made Richard blush. Victoria had smiled through it all, her hand resting possessively on her new husband's arm. And then came the toast. Harold raised his glass. 200 guests raised theirs. The orchestra played a soft flourish. Richard stood and pulled Victoria to her feet, beaming at her with the helpless devotion of a man who couldn't believe his good fortune. To the happy couple, Harold boomed, "May they have 50 years of joy." The glasses clinked, the guests cheered, and I heard it, a sound from behind me from inside the wall. At first I thought it was the house settling. Old mansions make all kinds of noises, particularly in winter when the wood contracts in the cold. But this wasn't the groan of old timber or the knock of pipes. This was different. This was a voice. "Help," it said. So quiet I almost didn't hear it over the orchestra. I went still. Everything in my training told me to ignore it. Old houses have old sounds. I was probably imagining things. I'd been working for 16 hours straight with barely a break. Fatigue does strange things to the mind. But then I heard it again. "Please." It was coming from the wall directly behind me. The beautiful, expensive, perfectly maintained wall. I glanced around. No one else had noticed. The toast continued. The orchestra swelled into a waltz. Richard led Victoria onto the dance floor, her white dress swirling around her like sea foam. I took a small step backward until my shoulders were nearly touching the wall. The silk paper was cool against my jacket. "Help me," the voice whispered. It was a woman's voice, young, terrified. So faint it might have been my imagination. Except it wasn't. My heart was beating faster now, though my face remained perfectly blank. 40 years of training kept my expression neutral, even as my mind raced. There was someone inside the wall, someone alive, someone who needed help. But how? The wall was solid. The paper was seamless. There were no doors, no panels, no obvious way that anyone could have gotten inside, unless someone had put them there. I thought of Victoria. I thought of the cold calculation in her eyes. I thought of the way she'd snapped at the flower girl, that sudden flash of cruelty before she remembered to smile. And I thought about what a woman like that might do to protect her new position, what she might be willing to hide, who she might be willing to hurt. I should have walked away right then, should have maintained my 40 years of perfect discretion. Should have remembered that butlers don't ask questions, and they certainly don't investigate mysterious voices coming from walls during society weddings. But something about that voice, that desperate plea for help, cut through decades of training. I couldn't walk away. I waited until the waltz ended, and the guests began moving toward the buffet tables. In the controlled chaos of 200 people heading for food, it was easy to slip away from the main crowd. Easy to drift toward the edge of the ballroom, where the light was dimmer and the attention was elsewhere. The wall looked perfect, but I'd been in enough old houses to know that perfect was usually an illusion. These mansions were full of secret spaces, hidden rooms, priest holes and servants' corridors, and places designed to hide things that shouldn't be seen. I ran my hand along the silk paper, feeling for irregularities. The texture was smooth, the seams invisible to the naked eye. But about 3 feet from the floor, I felt something Not a seam exactly, but a slight give in the wall, as if the plaster behind the paper was thinner there than it should be. "Help!" the voice came again, weaker now. I could hear the exhaustion in it, the dehydration. Whoever was in there had been there for a while. I pressed harder against the wall. The paper buckled slightly. There was definitely something behind it. Not solid wall, a space. I was going to need tools, a knife at minimum. Maybe a pry bar. I would have to go to the kitchen, find something that could cut through the paper without destroying it completely. And I would have to do it without anyone noticing that I'd left my post during the most important society wedding of the year. But before I could move, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Victoria stood 5 feet away, still in her wedding dress, champagne glass in hand. She looked at me. I looked at her. And in that moment, I knew. She knew I'd heard it. Knew what I was looking for, knew that I'd found the one thing she couldn't afford for anyone to find. Her face was perfectly pleasant. Her smile showed all her teeth. "James," she said, her voice like honey poured over broken glass. "Is something wrong with the wall?" Her eyes never left mine, blue and cold and absolutely merciless. And I realized that whatever was behind that wall, whoever was behind that wall, Victoria had put them there. The question was, what was I going to do about it? "No, Mrs. Hastings," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "Just admiring the craftsmanship. It's exceptional work." Her smile widened. It didn't reach her eyes. "It is, isn't it? Italian artisans." Richard spared no expense on the renovations. She took a sip of champagne, casual as anything. Some of the walls had to be completely redone. Structural issues, you understand. Old houses require such constant maintenance. Structural issues. The words hung in the air between us. I understood perfectly. She was telling me, without saying it directly, that she knew what was behind the wall, that she'd put it there, and that she was perfectly willing to explain it away as routine renovation if I pushed the issue. "Perhaps you should rejoin the celebration," she said. Her tone was light, but her eyes were hard as diamonds. "Richard was asking for you. Something about the wine service. It was a dismissal. More than that, it was a warning." I bowed my head slightly, the perfect servant acknowledging his employer. "Of course, Mrs. Hastings, my apologies for the distraction." I walked away from the wall, away from the voice, away from whatever horror Victoria had sealed behind Italian silk paper. But I didn't go back to the celebration. I went to find out who was behind that wall and why Victoria wanted them to die there. The kitchen was chaos. Caterers shouted orders in French and English and what might have been Portuguese. Steam rose from industrial-sized pots. The smell of cooking meat and melting butter filled the air. No one noticed when I slipped in and grabbed a thin-bladed carving knife from the rack near the prep station. I tucked it into the inner pocket of my jacket and left before anyone could ask questions. The Ashford mansion had been built in 1889 by a railroad tycoon named Edmund Ashford, a man whose fortune had been made by buying land for pennies and selling it to the government for track rights at prices that would make a modern-day corruption scandal look quaint. He'd built the mansion to rival the Newport cottages, those obscene displays of Gilded Age wealth that pretended to be modest summer homes while containing more square footage than most apartment buildings. Richard had bought it in 1975 for a price that the newspapers called a steal. What they didn't mention was that the place had been crumbling, riddled with dry rot and outdated electrical systems and plumbing that dated back to the McKinley administration. He'd spent the next decade renovating it, bringing in architects and engineers and, yes, Italian artisans who specialized in restoration work. The result was a house that looked like it had been frozen in 1889, but contained all the modern amenities a billionaire could want, including, apparently, secret spaces in the walls. I knew the house well enough by then. I'd studied the original blueprints when I first took the position with the Hastings family, the way I always did when starting work in a new household. It's important to know the bones of a place, the hidden pathways and service corridors that allow staff to move through a mansion without being seen by the owners. The east wall of the ballroom backed onto what had once been a servants' hallway, long since sealed off during the renovations and turned into additional storage space. If someone wanted to hide something, or someone in the walls, that would be the perfect place to do it. I made my way through the service corridors, moving quickly but not running. Running draws attention. Butlers don't run. We glide. The old servants' hallway was behind a door marked storage that most of the staff had probably never even noticed. It was locked, but I had keys. I always had keys. A butler who can't get into every room in the house is a butler who isn't doing his job properly. The door opened onto darkness. I found a light switch and flicked it. A single bare bulb illuminated a narrow corridor lined with old furniture covered in dust sheets, boxes of Christmas decorations, the accumulated junk that even billionaires accumulate but don't want to look at. The wall to my left was the backside of the ballroom's east wall. I could hear the orchestra through it, muffled but clear. They were playing something up-tempo. People were laughing. And somewhere in that wall, someone was dying. I ran my hand along the plaster, looking for what I'd felt from the other side. The wall here was unfinished, just bare plaster painted industrial white decades ago. My fingers found it quickly, a rectangular section about 4 feet high and 2 feet wide where the plaster was newer, smoother than the surrounding wall. Someone had sealed this section recently, within the last few days, given how fresh the plaster smelled. "Help," came the voice. Stronger now that I was closer. "Please, I can't breathe." "I'm here," I said quietly. "I'm going to get you out." I pulled the carving knife from my pocket. The blade was thin and sharp, meant for slicing tenderloin, but it would work for this. I pushed the tip into the plaster near the edge of the newer section. It sank in easily. The plaster was thin, just a skim coat over something behind it. I cut along the edge, working as quickly as I dared. Plaster dust fell like snow. The knife made a soft scraping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent corridor. "Who are you?" the voice asked. It was definitely a woman, young, maybe mid-20s, scared but trying to stay calm. "Someone who's going to help you," I said. "Don't talk. Save your strength." I'd cut along 3 sides of the rectangle now. I put my shoulder against it and pushed. The plaster cracked, then gave way entirely. A section of wall fell inward with a soft thud. Behind it was darkness and a smell. Dust and fear and human waste and something else. Something medical and wrong. I pulled my lighter from my pocket, a silver Zippo I'd carried since the war. The flame illuminated a space about 4 feet deep, running between the studs of the original wall. It was barely bigger than a coffin stood on end, and huddled at the bottom, covered in plaster dust and her own filth, was a woman. She looked up at me with eyes that had given up hope until just that moment. "Please," she whispered. "Please get me out." Her name was Sarah Mitchell. She was 26 years old, and she'd been sealed in that wall for 3 days. But I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that I was looking at someone who'd been left to die by a woman in a $75,000 wedding dress, and I had to get her out before that woman realized I'd found her. I reached into the space. Sarah grabbed my hand with both of hers. Her grip was weak, but desperate. I pulled and she half climbed, half fell out of the wall and onto the corridor floor. She was wearing what had once been a black housekeeping uniform, now stained and torn. Her dark hair was matted with sweat and plaster dust. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 3 days. "Water," she croaked. "Please." There was a utility sink at the end of the corridor. I half carried her to it, turned on the tap, and held her steady while she drank. She gulped it down like a woman who'd crossed a desert, water spilling down her chin and onto her ruined uniform. When she'd drunk enough to speak clearly, she looked at me with eyes full of tears and gratitude and absolute terror. "She'll kill me," Sarah said. "If she finds out I'm alive, she'll kill me." I knew exactly who she was talking about. "Tell me what happened," I said. "Tell me everything." And there, in that narrow corridor, while an orchestra played and 200 guests celebrated a wedding, Sarah Mitchell told me a story that would destroy the Hastings family forever. She'd been hired as a housekeeper at the Ashford estate 6 months earlier. It was good work, better pay than she'd made at her previous position at a hotel in Albany. Mr. Hastings was kind, if distant. The regular staff were professional. It seemed like the perfect job, until Victoria came along. Victoria had visited the estate several times during her engagement to Richard, always with suggestions for improvements, changes she wanted made before the wedding. New drapes in the master bedroom, different furniture in the drawing room. She'd walked through the house like she already owned it, which I suppose she nearly did. Sarah had been working on the second floor one afternoon in early December when she'd heard voices from the east wing. Victoria's voice and a man's, not Richard's. Someone younger. Sarah should have walked away, should have pretended she hadn't heard anything, but she'd been curious the way young people often are, and she'd peered around the corner to see who Victoria was talking to. It was Michael, the groundskeeper's son. 24 years old, handsome in the way that working-class boys often are, all lean muscle and easy charm. He'd been helping with the wedding preparations, setting up tents on the lawn, arranging chairs. And he'd been kissing Victoria in the upstairs hallway like his life depended on it. Sarah had gasped before she could stop herself. Victoria and Michael had broken apart. Victoria's face had gone from flushed passion to cold fury in an instant. She'd seen Sarah, made eye contact, smiled, and then she'd walked over calm as anything and said, "I think we need to have a conversation about discretion." Sarah had tried to apologize, tried to explain that she hadn't meant to intrude, that she wouldn't say anything to anyone. But Victoria had just kept smiling that terrible smile. She'd asked Sarah to help her with something in the East Wing. "Just a small task," she'd said. "It'll only take a moment." Sarah, too young and too trusting and too afraid of losing her job, had followed. Victoria had led her to the ballroom, to that perfect stretch of wall with its Italian silk paper. She'd shown Sarah a small section near the floor where the paper had pulled slightly away from the plaster. "This needs to be fixed before the wedding," Victoria had said. "Can you hold this piece flat while I mark where we need to apply adhesive?" Sarah had knelt down, pressing her hands against the paper, and that's when Michael had appeared behind her, no longer charming, his face blank and cold. He'd grabbed her. Sarah had tried to scream, but his hand was over her mouth. Victoria had watched with those dead blue eyes as Michael dragged Sarah through a door Sarah hadn't even known existed, into the old servants' corridor, into that narrow space between the walls. The last thing Sarah remembered before they sealed her in was Victoria's voice, casual as if she were discussing the weather. "She'll be quiet soon enough. The wall will muffle any noise. By the time the wedding is over, she'll be too weak to cause problems." And then they'd plastered over the opening, sealing Sarah in darkness with no water, no food, no room to move, nothing but the certainty that she would die there, while 200 people danced just feet away. 3 days. She'd been in that wall for 3 days. She'd screamed until her voice gave out, pounded on the wall until her hands bled, tried to claw through the plaster with her fingernails, but the wall was solid, and the silk paper on the other side muffled every sound. She'd given up hope 12 hours ago, had accepted that she would die there, that no one would find her until long after the wedding, when she was nothing but bones in a forgotten space, until she'd heard me on the other side of the wall, until she'd gathered enough strength for one more cry for help, until a butler who'd spent 40 years being invisible had finally decided to see. When she finished her story, we sat in silence in that corridor. The orchestra was playing a foxtrot. People were laughing. Richard Hastings was probably giving another toast, drunk on champagne and happiness, completely unaware that his new wife was a monster. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked. Her voice was small and broken. "They'll say I'm lying. They'll say I'm trying to ruin the wedding. Victoria will have an explanation. She always has an explanation. She was right. I knew she was right." Victoria would claim Sarah was a disgruntled employee seeking attention. would produce Michael to corroborate whatever story they'd concocted, would play the wounded bride, devastated that someone would try to ruin her special day with such cruel lies, and everyone would believe her, because people always believe the beautiful bride over the help, unless I could prove otherwise. I stood up, my knees cracked, 40 years old and feeling ancient. "Stay here," I told Sarah. "Don't move. Don't make a sound. I'll be back." "Where are you going?" she asked, panic rising in her voice. "To finish this," I said. I walked back through the corridor, back through the service areas, back to the celebration. The ballroom was loud with joy and music and the sound of people who had too much money to ever face consequences. I found Richard Hastings dancing with his new wife. They moved well together. She was smiling, he was beaming. I walked up to them, tapped Richard lightly on the shoulder. "Mr. Hastings," I said. "Sir, I need to speak with you immediately. It's urgent." He frowned. "Not now, James. Whatever it is can wait." "I'm afraid it cannot, sir." Victoria's eyes locked onto mine. They were the coldest thing I'd ever seen. "Your butler seems to have forgotten his place," she said sweetly. "Perhaps we should discuss his continued employment after the honeymoon." Richard looked between us, confused. The music swirled. The moment stretched. "Sir," I said quietly, "there is a woman sealed in your ballroom wall. Your wife put her there 3 days ago, and if we don't get her medical attention immediately, she will die." The music stopped. Not because I'd asked it to, not because anyone had heard what I said, but because every good story needs a moment where everything changes, and this was that moment. The guests nearest to us had stopped dancing. They were looking at us now, curious about what could possibly be so urgent that a butler would interrupt the groom's first dance with his bride. Victoria's face remained perfectly composed. Only her eyes changed, going from cold to absolutely arctic. "James has been working very hard," she said, her voice pitched to carry to the watching guests. "I think perhaps the stress has gotten to him. Darling, why don't we get him some water? He looks quite unwell." She was good. I had to give her that. In 3 seconds, she'd positioned me as unstable, overworked, possibly delusional. The guests were already nodding sympathetically. Poor Butler, pushed too hard, snapped under pressure. But I'd been in service for 40 years. I knew how to play this game too. "Mrs. Hastings," I said, my voice perfectly level, perfectly calm. "Would you care to explain to your husband why Sarah Mitchell has been missing from her duties for 3 days? Or perhaps you'd like to explain what structural renovations were done to the east wall of this ballroom, the ones that weren't in the original renovation plans." Her smile flickered, just for a second, but I saw it. Richard was looking between us now, confusion giving way to something else, concern, maybe even the first whisper of doubt. "Victoria," he said slowly, "what is he talking about?" She laughed. It was a beautiful sound, like bells, completely artificial. "I have no idea, darling. I think James may have been sampling too much of the champagne meant for the guests." "Sir," I said, speaking directly to Richard now, ignoring Victoria entirely, 3 days ago, one of your housekeepers witnessed something that made her a liability. She was sealed into the space behind the ballroom wall and left to die. I found her 20 minutes ago in the old servants' corridor. She's dehydrated and traumatized but alive, and she can identify who put her there. The ballroom had gone completely silent now, 200 guests all watching. The orchestra had lowered their instruments. Even the caterers had stopped moving. "This is insane," Victoria said. Her voice was rising now, losing that careful control. "This man is clearly having some kind of breakdown. Richard, call security. Have him removed immediately." But Richard wasn't listening to her anymore. He was looking at me with an expression I'd seen before, on the faces of men who suddenly realized that the ground beneath their feet wasn't as solid as they'd thought. "Where is she?" he asked quietly. "This woman you claim to have found." "In the storage corridor behind the east wall," I said. "Exactly where Mrs. Hastings and her accomplice left her." "Accomplice," Richard repeated. His face was going pale. Victoria moved then. Tried to. She took a step toward the door, her wedding dress rustling. Frank, I called to the head of security, a solid man who'd been with the Hastings family longer than I had. Don't let her leave this room. Frank looked at Richard. Richard, after a long moment, nodded. Victoria froze. Her mask was slipping now. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, see her trying to find a way out of this. You have no proof, she said. It was no longer a bride's voice. It was something colder, harder. You have the word of a servant against mine. Who do you think people will believe? I think, I said calmly, that they'll believe the woman I pulled out of a sealed wall, the woman who can describe in detail how you and Michael Reeves dragged her into that space and left her to suffocate. Michael Reeves, the groundskeeper's son. The moment I said his name, I saw Victoria's face change. That was her mistake, you see. She'd thought I only knew about Sarah. She hadn't realized I knew about him too. Who the hell is Michael Reeves? Richard asked. His voice was deadly quiet now. Before I could answer, there was a commotion at the ballroom entrance. Sarah Mitchell stumbled into the room, supported by two of the kitchen staff who'd apparently found her in the corridor where I'd left her. She looked like something from a nightmare. Her uniform was filthy and torn. Her face was streaked with plaster dust and tears. Her hands were bloody from clawing at the wall. She looked like exactly what she was, someone who'd been buried alive and somehow survived. The guests gasped. Several women screamed. Someone dropped a champagne glass, and it shattered on the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. Sarah looked across the ballroom. Her eyes found Victoria. "You," Sarah said. Her voice was a rasp, but it carried in the silence. "You did this to me." Richard turned to his wife. His face was the color of old paper. "Victoria," he said, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't do this." For a moment I thought she might try to maintain the lie, might try to explain it away, to spin some story that would make her the victim and Sarah the aggressor. But she'd been backed into a corner, and cornered animals do desperate things. "She did it to herself," Victoria spat. "She was spying on me, trying to blackmail me. She sealed herself in that wall to make me look bad, to ruin our wedding day out of petty jealousy. It was an absurd lie, transparent and desperate. But she wasn't talking to the guests anymore. She was talking to Richard, trying to find any thread of his love for her that might make him want to believe her. Richard looked at her like he'd never seen her before. Like she was a stranger who'd somehow replaced the woman he'd married an hour ago. "Call the police," he said to Frank. His voice was hollow. "Call them now." Victoria's last bit of composure shattered. She whirled on me, her beautiful face twisted with rage. "You," she hissed, "you stupid, interfering old man. You've ruined everything, everything. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I saved a woman's life," I said simply. "That seems rather more important than your wedding day, Mrs. Hastings." She lunged at me then. Actually lunged, her hands reaching for my throat, all pretense of civilization gone. Frank caught her before she reached me, pulling her back as she screamed obscenities that shocked even the wealthy guests, who thought they'd heard everything. Richard just stood there, watching his bride of 1 hour reveal herself as something monstrous. I saw his face crumble, saw the man who'd been so in love just minutes ago realize that he'd married a stranger, a beautiful, terrible stranger who'd been willing to let an innocent woman die to protect a secret. The police arrived within 15 minutes. The Ashford estate was remote, but Richard Hastings was a billionaire, and when billionaires called for help, help came quickly. The lead detective was a woman named Margaret Walsh, 40-something and sharp-eyed. She took one look at Sarah, still being treated by the estate's doctor, who'd been summoned from the guest quarters, and her expression went hard. "Someone want to tell me what the hell happened here," she said. So I told her. Everything. While Victoria screamed about lawyers and false accusations, while Richard sat in a chair, looking like he'd aged 20 years in 20 minutes, while 200 guests whispered and stared, I told Detective Walsh exactly what I'd found and how I'd found it. And then Sarah told her story, haltingly at first, her voice still rough from screaming and dehydration. but gaining strength as she went, as she described Victoria and Michael dragging her into that narrow space, as she described the sound of plaster being applied to seal her in, as she described 3 days of darkness and terror and the certainty that she would die alone. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the ballroom, except for Victoria's. Her eyes were dry and hard and full of nothing but rage. "You can't prove any of this," Victoria said to Detective Walsh. "It's her word against mine. Where's your evidence?" Detective Walsh looked at her for a long moment. "Well," she said slowly, "there's the sealed space in the wall that matches her description exactly. There's the fresh plaster in the servants' corridor. There's her physical condition, which is consistent with prolonged confinement. And then there's this." She held up a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a gold bracelet. "We found this in the wall space where Miss Mitchell was held," Walsh said. "It has an inscription, 'To Victoria with love, R.H.' That would be you, Mr. Hastings?" Richard nodded mutely. "I lost that bracelet 3 days ago," Victoria said quickly. "She must have stolen it. This proves she's a thief. Or," Walsh said, "it proves you lost it while sealing her into the wall. Funny how these things work out." She turned to 2 uniformed officers who'd come in behind her. "Read Mrs. Hastings her rights," she said. "We're taking her in for attempted murder." The officers moved forward. Victoria backed away, her wedding dress sweeping behind her. "You can't do this," she said. Her voice was rising toward hysteria. "Richard, tell them they can't do this. I'm your wife. You have to protect me." Richard looked at her, really looked at her, and when he spoke, his voice was cold and empty. "I don't even know who you are," he said. They handcuffed her there in the ballroom, in her $75,000 dress, in front of 200 witnesses. She screamed the whole time. Screamed about injustice and conspiracies and how they were all going to pay for this. But underneath the screaming, I heard something else. Fear. Real, genuine fear. Because Victoria had spent her whole life being beautiful and charming and manipulating people into giving her what she wanted. And for the first time in her life, it wasn't working. "What about Michael Reeves?" I asked Walsh, as they were leading Victoria out. "Already picked him up," she said. "He was trying to leave the estate through the back gate, ran right into a patrol car. He's singing like a canary, trying to cut a deal. Says the whole thing was Victoria's idea, that she promised him money if he helped her, that he didn't know she was going to leave the girl to die." Walsh's expression made it clear what she thought of that particular defense. "They'll both be going away for a long time," she said. "You did good work here. Most people would have walked away, pretended they didn't hear anything." "I'm not most people," I said. She smiled. It was tired but genuine. "No," she said. "I don't suppose you are." The guests left quickly after that. No one wanted to stay at a wedding that had turned into a crime scene. They filed out in their expensive clothes and their expensive jewelry, whispering to each other about what they'd seen, about the scandal they'd witnessed. By midnight, the Ashford mansion was empty except for Richard, Sarah, the police, and me. Sarah was taken to the hospital for observation and treatment. Before she left, she found me in the now empty ballroom. I was supervising the cleanup crew, because even in the midst of catastrophe, someone had to make sure the champagne glasses got collected and the food got put away. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved my life. I did what anyone should have done," I told her. "But you were the only one who did it," she said. "That matters." She hugged me. It was awkward and unexpected and entirely inappropriate for the butler-servant relationship, but I hugged her back anyway. This young woman who'd come so close to dying because she'd seen something she shouldn't have seen. After she left, Richard found me. He changed out of his tuxedo into simple slacks and a sweater. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. "James," he said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. "I should have listened to you sooner," he continued, "when you interrupted the dance. I should have trusted you instead of assuming you were having some kind of breakdown. I should have—" He trailed off. There were too many things he should have done, too many signs he'd missed. "How did I not see it?" he asked. "How did I not see what she was?" "You saw what she wanted you to see," I said gently. That's what people like her do. They're very good at it. He nodded slowly. My first wife, Catherine, he said. She knew. Toward the end, before the cancer took her, she told me to be careful, said that there were women out there who would see me as a wallet with legs. I thought she was just being protective. I thought I was smarter than that. None of us are as smart as we think we are, sir. He laughed. It was a bitter sound. No, he said, I suppose we're not. He was quiet for a moment, looking around the ballroom. The beautiful decorations, the flowers that had cost a fortune, the silk wallpaper that had nearly become a tomb. I'm going to sell this place, he said suddenly. The Ashford estate. I can't be here anymore. Every time I look at that wall, I'll think about what almost happened. What did happen? That's understandable, sir. And James. Yes, sir? Thank you, he said. Thank you for being the kind of man who listens when someone cries for help. Thank you for not being invisible when it mattered most. It was the most genuine thing Richard Hastings had ever said to me in 3 years of employment. You're welcome, sir, I said. The trial was 6 months later. It made all the newspapers, of course. Beautiful bride attempts murder, billionaire's wedding horror, society scandal, the headlines wrote themselves. Victoria's lawyers tried everything, claimed Sarah was mentally unstable, claimed she'd sealed herself in the wall, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by an interfering butler and an attention-seeking housekeeper. But the evidence was overwhelming. The fresh plaster, the bracelet, Sarah's testimony, Michael's confession, given in exchange for a reduced sentence, and my own testimony, delivered calmly and precisely, describing everything I'd seen and heard. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found Victoria Crane guilty of attempted murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The judge gave her 25 years. Michael Reeves got 15. Sarah Mitchell received a settlement from Richard Hastings that ensured she'd never have to work again if she didn't want to. Last I heard, she'd gone back to school, was studying to be a social worker, helping other young women who'd been victimized by people in power. Richard never remarried. He sold the Ashford estate to a tech entrepreneur who didn't know its history. He lived quietly in his Manhattan penthouse, older and sadder and I think wiser. And me, I retired 6 months after the trial. 40 years and 6 months of service. It seemed like enough. I bought a small house in Vermont, nothing grand, just a cottage with a view of the mountains and enough space for a garden. I spend my days reading and walking and occasionally giving talks at hospitality schools about the ethics of service, because that's what it comes down to, in the end. Ethics. Knowing when the old rules have to be broken because following them would make you complicit in something evil. For 40 years, I'd been the perfect butler, invisible, silent, discreet. I'd watched wealthy people do terrible things and said nothing, because that was my job. That was what I was paid for. But that night at the Ashford mansion, I'd made a different choice. I'd chosen to see, to hear, to act. I'd chosen to be human instead of invisible, and it had saved a life. I think about that sometimes when I'm working in my garden or sitting on my porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. I think about all the times I could have spoken up and didn't, all the small cruelties I witnessed and ignored, all the moments when I chose discretion over conscience. I can't change those moments, can't go back and make different choices, but I can tell you about them. I can tell you that wealth doesn't make people good, that beauty can hide monstrosity. That the people who serve you, the ones you barely notice, the ones who pour your wine and open your doors and clean your houses, they see everything. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very unlucky, depending on your perspective, one of them decides to stop being invisible. I never saw Victoria again after the trial. She's in a women's correctional facility upstate, serving her 25 years. I heard she's not adjusting well to prison life. Apparently, the other inmates don't respond well to her particular brand of manipulation. I can't say I'm surprised. Michael got out after 10 years for good behavior. I heard he moved to Florida, changed his name, tried to start over. I hope he learned something from his time inside. I hope he learned that helping someone commit a crime, even if they promise you money, even if they bat their beautiful eyes and make you feel special, is still a crime. I hope he learned that some choices can't be undone. Sarah and I exchange Christmas cards every year. She's doing well, got her degree, married a teacher, has 2 kids now. In her last card, she included a photo of her family. They were all smiling. Real smiles, the kind that reach the eyes. She'd named her daughter Catherine after Richard's first wife, the woman who'd tried to warn him, the woman who died before she could save him from his own blind optimism. It was a good name. A strong name. Richard died 2 years ago, heart attack. Quick and relatively painless, according to his doctors. He left most of his fortune to charity, left me a generous sum that I didn't need but accepted, because refusing it would have dishonored his memory. He left Sarah an even larger sum, and a letter. She showed it to me when she came to Vermont for his memorial service. It was short, just 3 sentences. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. Thank you for surviving. You deserved so much better than what my blindness nearly cost you. She cried when she read it to me, not sad tears. Something more complicated than that. Grief and relief and forgiveness all mixed together. He was a good man in the end, she said. He just loved the wrong person. Most of us do at some point, I told her. The trick is what we do when we realize our mistake. Richard had done the right thing. Eventually. When it was almost too late, but not quite. That counts for something. The Ashford mansion stands empty now. The tech entrepreneur who bought it never moved in, said the place had bad energy, put it back on the market after 6 months. It's still for sale, has been for years. No one wants to live in a house where someone was nearly murdered. No one wants to sleep in rooms where evil walked around in a wedding dress. Sometimes I drive by it when I'm in the area. The gardens are overgrown now. The windows are dark. The for sale sign creaks in the wind. And I think about that December night in 1987, about the choices I made, about the woman I saved, about the monster I helped expose. I think about all the butlers and housekeepers and drivers and cooks who work in houses like that, who see things they shouldn't see, who hear things they shouldn't hear, who have to decide every single day whether to stay invisible or to act. Most of them stay invisible. It's safer that way, easier. You keep your job, you keep your head down, you don't make waves, but sometimes staying invisible means becoming complicit. Sometimes staying invisible means someone dies. I learned that lesson late in my career. But I learned it, and I'm telling you this story now because I need you to understand something important that took me 40 years to figure out. There's a difference between discretion and cowardice, between professionalism and moral paralysis, between respecting privacy and enabling abuse. And when you hear someone screaming for help, when you know in your bones that something terrible is happening, you have a choice. You can pretend you didn't hear it, can convince yourself it's not your problem, not your business, not your place to interfere, or you can do what I did that December night. You can investigate, you can act. You can choose, just once, to be seen instead of invisible. Will it cost you? Maybe. Probably. I never worked as a butler again after that night. My reputation in certain circles was ruined. I was the butler who'd embarrassed a billionaire on his wedding day, who'd made a scene, who'd forgotten his place. But I saved a life. And every morning, when I wake up in my little house in Vermont, when I make my coffee and watch the sun rise over the mountains, I know I made the right choice. Even if it cost me everything, I made the right choice. Because at the end of the day, at the end of our lives, we're not remembered for how invisible we were. We're not remembered for how well we kept other people's secrets or how perfectly we served their wine. We're remembered for the moments when we chose to be human, when we chose conscience over comfort, when we chose to help someone who desperately needed help, even when it would have been easier to walk away. That's what matters. That's what lasts. Not the champagne or the mansions or the society weddings, the moments when we choose to see each other, the moments when we choose to act, the moments when we refuse to be invisible. That December night in 1987, I heard screaming coming from a wall. And instead of walking away, instead of pretending I heard nothing, I chose to investigate. That choice saved Sarah Mitchell's life. That choice exposed Victoria Crane for what she truly was. That choice ended my career as a butler and began my life as something more important, a human being who gave a damn. And you know what? I'd make that same choice again, 1,000 times over. Because some things are more important than discretion. Some things are more important than keeping your job or maintaining appearances or respecting the privacy of the wealthy. Human life is one of those things. Human dignity is one of those things. Basic human decency is one of those things. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this. When you hear someone crying for help, don't walk away. Don't pretend you didn't hear it. Don't convince yourself it's not your problem. Listen, investigate, act. Be the person who refuses to be invisible when it matters most. Because 40 years from now, when you're sitting in your own little house watching the sunset, you want to be able to look back on your life and know that you did the right thing, even if it cost you everything. Especially if it cost you everything. That's how you know it was worth it. If this story moved you, I need to ask you something. In the comments below, tell me, have you ever witnessed something wrong and stayed silent? Or found the courage to speak up even when it was difficult? Your story matters. Share it with us. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who needs to be reminded that silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit, share this with them. Sometimes the stories that change us are the ones we pass along to others who need to hear them. Until next time, remember this. We're not remembered for how well we followed the rules. We're remembered for the moments when we broke them, because doing the right thing mattered more. Thank you for listening, thank you for being here, and thank you for being the kind of person who believes that one voice, one choice, one moment of courage can change everything. Because it can. I'm living proof.